Hi everyone. Today it's an important lesson because this has probably happened to all of you who've owned orchids. You buy one in the store and it's got a nice spike and there are flowers all over the place. And then after about less than a week, all the flowers start to die. And then upon removing the orchid from its container, you find, uh-oh, there are no roots. So W5 here is a worst case scenario. W4, sometimes you're left with these old looking roots. A lot of the times they're accompanied by really squishy roots that have succumbed to fungus. And so as a result, a lot of these orchids just end up in the trash, which is a shame because with a little patience, you can bring them back to life. So in the initial stages, you'll get some root growth like this, and then they slowly get longer and longer and more roots appear. And then finally you end up with something that looks like this. And that takes about a year and a half. And before we go on to discuss how we're going to water these plants, I'd like to discuss orchid food and what are called mycorrhizae. Now, I'm not an expert on plant fertilizers, so I'm just trusting that Miracle-Gro knows what it's doing when they prepare what's known as orchid food. Now, the three most important elements of this particular Miracle-Gro concoction is 30% of nitrogen, 10% of phosphate, and 10% of potash. It's also referred to as a 30-10-10 mixture. There are other mixtures like 20-20-20 that some people recommend. Next up are a whole series of fungi called mycorrhizae. So what are mycorrhizae? Well, they're ubiquitous, beneficial fungi that normally have a symbiotic relationship with the roots of plants. And they're found everywhere. Everywhere there's a plant, there are these fungi in the soil working with the roots in a symbiotic way. However, since we're dealing with air culture and the people who use this for hydroponics, there isn't a symbiotic association because there's no soil. So it's basically a one-way street in the case of hydroponics and air culture. All right, now we get to the fun part. And my watering container, watering can, is 1.75 quarts, so it's just shy of a half a gallon. And what I'd like to show you is how much of the mycorrhizae powder I add to it and how much of the orchid food I add to it. So the hydroponic application for the mycorrhizae is 1 teaspoon for 10 gallons, which would translate then to 1/10 of a teaspoon for 1 gallon and 1/20 of a teaspoon for a half a gallon. So 1/20 of a teaspoon is about 1/3 of this, but I'm doing it every 2 days, and this stuff is really expensive. I think it's about $35 for this. So I'm going to use much less than that, and I've been very successful with that. So I'm just going to get a little pinch. There, see that? And we'll go with that. Put it in. And the Miracle-Gro has a recommendation of 1 tablespoon per gallon, but that's over a 2-week period. So I'm going to take about the same amount with the Miracle-Gro. So there you go, just a smidgen, proportion of 1/8 of a teaspoonful. Let's put this in. Okay. Take a chopstick and stir it all up. Okay, so before watering, a very important thing to do is, assuming that you've cleaned everything up, is to put it in its vase or whatever container you've decided to use and let it sit there for a couple of days to dry out. The reason being that mold and fungus can't survive without moisture, although mold spores can still remain on the surface and be reactivated by the presence of water. Then, after the 2 days, what I'd like you to do is stick your nose in here and smell. And there shouldn't be any odor. But if there is a foul odor, it means that there still is fungus that has gone undetected by you. So in that case, you need to use a fungicide, and Phalaenopsis 20 was recommended to me. And what you do is take the orchid out, fill the vase with water up to about here, put just a little, maybe a couple of drops of Phalaenopsis in there, mix it in, and then put the orchid back in and let it sit there for 15 to 30 minutes. And then after you're done with that treatment, you should let it dry out for another 2 days and you should be good. So let's say the 2 days have passed. Now just do your sniff test again. And the Phalaenopsis has a particular smell, so you want to be able to distinguish that from the stench of rottingness. But it should be okay. And then the second thing you want to do is make sure that all of this area on the bottom of the orchid is bone dry. And I'll show you how to check that out. Now, what I've found is that this area right around here, your lips and just below your nose, are very sensitive to water. Like you can smell when something is moist, like a sponge, even if there's the slightest amount of moisture. Another thing you can do is just take this and touch your bottom lip with it, you know, and you can see immediately that it's bone dry, and that's what you want. And now what we're going to do is get a fix on where the level of water should be. And I'd like to cover the entire stem and then bring it up to where it's touching the bottom of the leaf. This way, this whole area will be affected by the fertilizer and the mycorrhizae. And then we'll just leave the water there for about a half an hour. And there we have it. You can see that the water level, let me shake it for you so you see where the water level is above the stem and touching that bottom leaf, okay? So I know I already said a half an hour, but a half an hour to 45 minutes every couple of days will do the trick. And you don't want to be pushing this process with overwatering, okay? You just got to be very patient and accept the fact that you just have to wait. And in a situation like this one, I'd like to get the water to come up and cover this top root, all right? So I've been doing it with this one for several months, and it's really coming through. You know, it's really working out. So let's add water to that. And here's the result. You can see that it's covering that top root, and this big root's covered. It's touching the bottom of the leaf. So you get an idea of how much water is in there. And again, it's only 30 minutes to 45 minutes every 2 days, so there's no danger here in oversaturating anything. Now, after the time is up, you can just remove the orchid from the vase and then attach a funnel to your water can and then just dump the water back in, because you can reuse this water 2 or 3 times. And after like the 3rd application, you can just dump the water out and start all over again with a new concoction. So I have 5 of these orchids that I'm currently working on. And here's each one of them. And each one is submerged into water, in water, right up to its first leaf. So that's pretty much it. Then after the 30 to 45 minutes, you want to put the water back in, make sure that all the vases are completely empty, and then just wait for 2 days. I would wait 48 hours, try to be as exact as you can. And then very importantly, after that 48-hour period, you always want to do the 2 tests. You want to do the smell test again and the dryness test before reintroducing the orchid to water. Because don't forget, the reason why we had all this root rot in the first place was because of water. Too much water, that is. So I think I've taken up enough of your time now. And what I'll do is I'll make a separate video, maybe tomorrow or sometime in the near future, showing you the results of this method on each one of these orchids. You know, how the roots developed, how the leaves are developing, etc. Okay, so thanks again for joining me.